Hello, everyone, and welcome to our panel for this session of the Palestine Writes Literary Festival. The panel is entitled The Parallel Lives of Ghassan Kanafani and James Baldwin. My name is Maha Nassar. I'll be the moderator for this session. I'm coming to you from Tucson, Arizona, on the indigenous lands of the Thono Otham Nation and the Pasquayaki tribe. Before we begin, I have a few announcements to make. I would encourage you to use the hashtag Palestine Writes if you would like to live tweet or otherwise engage with our panel on via social media. When we open it up for a question and answer after the presentations, I'd encourage you to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen so that we can have a single place where we can moderate and take a look at the questions and comments. This is a bilingual panel. So if you have a preferred language that you would like to listen to, at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a globe and it says interpretation underneath it. You can click it and choose your language preference for the, whether it's English or Arabic. And if the sound is too low, you can mute the original audio and then the translator should be at a higher audio. Finally, all of our participants' books are on sale, along with many other items at the Palestine Writes book show. And I would encourage you to go to the ACA showroom to take a look at books and other items that are on sale. So with that, I'll go ahead and introduce our four panelists, and I'll introduce them in the order in which they'll speak. First, we'll hear from Josema Habeya, an award-winning Palestinian novelist, columnist, translator, and poet. Her novels include The Origin of Love, Before the Queen Falls Asleep, and Velvet. Her short story collections include Sweeter Night, The Man Who Recurs, and A Form of Absence. She is the recipient of multiple awards, including the Mahmoud Saifuddin Al-Irani Award for Short Stories, the Jerusalem Festival of Youth Innovation Award in Short Stories, and the Naguib Mahfouz Medal for Literature. Next, we'll hear from Rami Abushehab. He is a Palestinian poet and critic who's published more than 8 books, including his most recent poetry collection titled I Am from Palestine. His weekly columns appear in Al-Quds Al-Arabi, where he focuses on issues related to diaspora, refugees, and narratives, in addition to writing film reviews. Rami sits on numerous literary competition juries and has participated in numerous literary festivals and cultural conferences. Then we'll hear from Dr. Robin D.G. Kelley, Distinguished Professor and Gary B. Nash Endowed Chair in U.S. History at the University of California, Los Angeles. He is the author of 7 books, including Freedom Dreams, The Black Radical Imagination, and Africa Speaks, America Answers. He's also the author of over 100 magazine articles, which have been featured in The Nation, Monthly Review, The Voice Literary Supplement, The New York Times, Rolling Stones, and elsewhere. Last but not least, we'll hear from Dr. Bill Mullen, Professor Emeritus of American Studies at Purdue University. He is co-editor with Ashley Dawson of Against Apartheid, The Case for Boycotting Israeli Universities, and he's the author of James Baldwin, Living in the Fire. He's a member of the U.S. Campaign for the Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel and faculty advisor for Purdue Students for Justice in Palestine. And I would encourage you all to consult the program. I just gave you a snippet of their bios, and you can find fuller list of their accomplishments and writings in the program. Our esteemed panelists will discuss the lives and writings of James Baldwin and Ghassan Kanafani and discuss how their ideas have intersected with one another, even though they never knew each other, and how they were both seen as being far ahead of their time in both their specific location as well as in global intellectual thought. So without further ado, we will begin with Huzama.
Hi, Maha, Bill, Robin, and Rami, of course. I'm so happy to be among such distinguished company. I look forward to having an intriguing discussion, and I'd like to welcome also everyone who's joining us today in this session. I will start by presenting my take on Ghassan Kanafani's writings in general, and then I would approach what I describe as defining year for both Kanafani and Baldwin, where their lives took parallel paths. Ghassan Kanafani, Writing as Home. Ghassan Kanafani was a prolific Palestinian author and multi-talented artist. His work includes short stories, novels, plays, as well as journalistic articles, critical essays, and analytical studies. He was also a talented painter, and he was a political activist, a voice to the voiceless, or as someone described him once, a commander who never fired a gun. Most importantly, Ghassan Kanafani was a refugee whose family took refuge in Lebanon before moving to Syria following the Palestinian Nakba, the catastrophe. Kanafani was a front-runner of Palestinian resistance literature, which helped shape a rich genre of Palestinian prose and poetry and preserve Palestinian identity and culture at a very critical time when the Israeli colonial project went to great lengths to eradicate everything that represents Palestine and embodies Palestinianhood. At the peak of his activism and creativity, Kanafani was assassinated in Beirut in 1972 at only 36 years old, leaving an unparalleled legacy that holds an iconic place in modern Arabic literature. He left us too young and too beautiful. However, he remains conspicuously present. His writings have been revisited and reread by hundreds of thousands of people ever since, and each time in a different scope or context that sheds even more light into the meaning of his words, showing their rather alarmingly prophetic nature. The Palestinian condition is unique, though not unprecedented. There are many instances of history when natives have been uprooted and ethnically cleansed. It is an intricate canvas of a main narrative and sub-narratives where the Palestinian persona is the victim of an open-ended attempt at negation and annihilation. The humane is overshadowed by the political, which can stigmatize who are helpless, unable to tell their stories, or simply incapable of standing up for themselves. Often, we've had to watch our unbearable loss and agony sidelined in the course of a bigger twisted historical and political discourse, turning us, the Palestinians, into a byproduct or a side effect, rather than the root of the question and the actual cause, making us feel ashamed that we do not belong, that we no more have a home, that we are without a homeland. For Kanafani, the Palestinians are not simply collateral damage. They are the cause that needs to be addressed persistently, a cause that, like an open wound, continues to bleed, and which time will only make it fester. His writings in this sense were meant to delve deep into this wound, which made it all the more painfully telling. For Kanafani, the Palestinians are the trauma, not the stigma. He made sure to make his traumatized people seen and heard vividly, allowing them to wear their hearts on their sleeves, be transparent, fragile, vulnerable, deeply in pain, and crushed under feelings of misery and uprootedness. Kanafani gave his characters a space to share their aborted hopes and dreams, their sorrows and regrets. He framed the Palestinian trauma of dispossession and displacement in a vibrant narrative, which is regenerated endlessly and viciously, all the while being universally relatable and identifiable. Although his activism was intertwined with his prose, Kanafani managed skillfully to keep his literary work untarnished by demagogic discourse, steering it away from sloganeering, staying true to himself. Even when he trod upon thorny political issues, it was through the consequences brought by them and their toll on the humans concerned, that is, the Palestinians whose trauma was depicted by him in a captivating narrative engulfed with poetic realism. In his early writings, Kanafani embraced Palestine as a cause in and of itself, singling it out as a one-nation calamity. Then, Palestine transformed in his stories into a symbol for injustice, oppression, discrimination, and deprivation. It became an embodiment of the greatest grievance ever, What does it mean to be driven out of your home? What does it feel to be haunted with the smell of a land that was taken from you? How can you reclaim the memories that were robbed from you or safeguard what is left of them? How can you make ends meet in an endless world of betrayal and abandonment? Definitely, many can relate to that. I would dare say that Kanafani widened the scope of his perspective by endowing the predicament of others with a sense of Palestinianism. He identified with the suffering of the other through his own plight. He was the best to capture the meaning of loss, since his loss was unimaginably colossal. He himself was a witness and a victim of an ongoing betrayal, projecting his personal trauma and the collective Palestinian trauma onto others. And similarly, the traumas and agonies of the others were treated in the context of his trauma. They were, in a way, Palestinized. After all, who can feel the unprivileged, the impoverished, the oppressed, and unjustly treated better than the unprivileged, impoverished, and oppressed himself? All the pains in the world, when Palestinized, would become more intense and unsettling and strikingly more relatable. Talking now about the parallel paths between Kanafani versus Baldwin, James Baldwin, I would like to talk about what I call the defining year. 1948 marks what we may describe as a defining year for both Ghassan Kanafani and James Baldwin, for it was in 1948 that each of their lives took a turning point, which was drastically transformative for both, shaping not only their beliefs and what they fought for, but also repositioning their writings towards impressing their own personal history in the context of a bigger political and social injustice. In 1948, Baldwin left the American soil, immigrating to Paris. He was 24 years old, already known then among literary circles in the US as a promising young author, where his writings were welcomed by reputable publications. Baldwin's decision to go to Europe may have been a conscious choice of self-exile. It was not a surprising decision, though, as it had been building up for years, largely due to Baldwin's disillusionment with the intellectual establishment in his homeland, where embedded racial prejudice was norm. When Baldwin left the US, he became free from the social tenor of his birthplace that helped cement and propagate systematic racial discrimination. In Europe, Baldwin found himself, or he regained himself. As he noted in a New York Times interview, and I quote, "I could see where I came from very clearly. I am the grandson of a slave and I'm a writer. I must deal with both," end of quote. In a heated debate at the Dick Cavett Show in 1968 on the issue of racial discrimination between James Baldwin and Yale professor Paul Weiss, Baldwin declared that he chose to leave America specifically to run away, without necessarily caring about where he ended up. He said, and I quote, when I left this country in 1948, I left this country for one reason only, one reason. I did not care where I went. I ended up in Paris, on the streets of Paris with $40 in my pockets, on the theory that nothing worse could happen to me there than had already happened to me here. End of quote. Baldwin, it seems, felt he would not make it as a writer by himself in the US. He went on to say, and I quote, "Once you turn your back on this society, you may die. The years I lived in Paris did one thing for me. They released me from that particular social terror, which is not the paranoia of my mind, but a real social danger, visible in the face of every cop, every boss, everybody," end of quote. As for Kanafani, in 1948, he was 12 years old when his family witnessed one of the biggest exoduses in modern history, as hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were driven away from their homeland. All of a sudden, the young boy found himself labeled as a refugee, which would shape his perspective towards life and writings. while Baldwin's America was a stifling space, leaving him opting to find home somewhere else, Kanafani's Palestine became a larger-than-life world, and his memories about home never dwindled. Even more so, these memories were preserved and retold, becoming part of a collective Palestinian memory that he would cherish and reproduce as a means of safeguarding his homeland, which would be there waiting for him to be back. Thus, in Paris or anywhere in the world other than America, Baldwin found home in himself, developing a sense of belonging that never betrayed him. His dignity was maintained, and his life was not under threat of any sort. Kanafani, however, saw no life worth living outside Palestine, and for him, any attempt otherwise was doomed to failure, or would lead those choosing the wrong path to home to end up in a dumpster, forgotten, humiliated, and left to rot in faraway, unwelcoming lands. Out of America, Baldwin felt safe. He was out of home, but not out of place. Out of Palestine, Kanafani was unsafe, agitated, and out of place. Eventually, his life was taken from him for what he held tight to, his homeland. Still, both Baldwin and Kanafani could see clearly where they came from, and they knew what they were, and most importantly, both knew what they were not. Both would not succumb to any labeling of any kind. Both found their voice, and their voice brought them their own personal freedom. Both had an intact moral compass, and they knew where to point it. Both had a cause to stand up for, and both stood up for it brilliantly and bravely. In the end, writing for both of them became a home. I would like finally to conclude with Kanafani's definition of home or homeland, as he puts it in his heartbreaking novel, Returning to Haifa, when Saeed, the protagonist, tells his wife, Safiya, and I quote both in Arabic and in English, هل تعرفين ما هو الوطن يا صفية؟ الوطن هو أن لا يحدث ذلك كله. Do you know what a homeland is, Safiya? Homeland is where none of this happens at all. End of quote. Definitely. Home is that this long-standing history of injustice should have never been allowed to happen. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Huzama, for that wonderful introductory remarks that really help us set the stage for our further comments and discussions. A virtual clap to you, and I'm sure many others as well. Speaking of which, we are now up to 270 participants on this panel. I'd like to welcome all of you who've logged in since my initial welcome at 1 p.m. And just a couple of quick reminders for those who logged in recently to use the hashtag Palestine Writes to engage in social media or to talk about what it is that we are engaged with here. To remind you too that the authors and panelists have their books available in the bookstore. You can go to the Akka showroom. And finally, if you would like translation and interpretation, you can click the globe at the bottom for simultaneous English-Arabic translation. So next we'll turn to our second panelist, Rami Abushehab. Go ahead, Rami.
Hello, everyone. I am very happy to be with you in this event. I would like to thank all the organizers to organize this great festival. I will now speak in Arabic. For that, I ask audience to choose English if they cannot understand Arabic. عندما دعيت للكتابة عن الأديب الفلسطيني غسان كنفاني والروائي الأمريكي جيمس بالدوين وما يكمن بينهما من مشترك، بدت لي الفكرة حينها على قدر كبير من الصعوبة نظرا لعدم وجود دلائل أو تواصل حقيقي بين الأديبين. على الرغم من تزامنهما تاريخيا عن سياق تنهض على المقاومة والتحرر، بيد أن الفكرة بدت لي ذات وجاهة كونها تكشف عن نموذج ثقافي قار لا يمكن إلا أن يصدر إلا عن وعي بالغبن الذي تتقاسمه الذوات الجمعية في نضالها إنسانيا، كونها في النهاية تحتمل قدرا واحدا من المصير، وأعني البحث عن الخلاص الذي ربما يجمع بين كنفاني وبالدوين. فعلى الرغم من عدم معرفة أحدهما الآخر، غير أنهما قد يظهران على اتصال مشترك بالصيغة والمنظور والخطاب، ولا سيما على مستوى التمثيل السردي، والأهم الاستراتيجيات التي تبناها كل منهما للمواجهة وتقويض النماذج المتعالية من العنصرية. ولعلنا أو في هذه الندوة ربما أصدقائي وزملائي يقدمون لنا شيئا من تلك العلاقة نتيجة البحوث التي قاموا بها، أو ربما قد تقودنا صدفة ما إلى وجود علاقة أو تواصل فعلي بين الرجلين. ولكن يجب ألا ننسى أن كليهما روائيان قد نالا قدرا كبيرا من الحضور الرمزي أو الأيقوني في وجدان وعي أمتيهما، وهما أيضا مناضلان حملا القلم بوصفه وسيلة لرسم خط الاحتجاج. وإذا كان الزمن لم يسعف غسان كنفاني كما أسعف جيمس بالدوين، فإن الأول قد تمكن من إدراك مقولته وتعميقها في ذلك الزمن الطارئ أو المحدود. ولو قيض أو قدر لكنفاني فسحة من الزمن لأمكن أن يكون اللقاء بين كنفاني وبالدوين فعلا متحققا على أكثر من مستوى. في المحور الثاني أريد أن أتحدث عن الأعمال الأدبية من حيث الرؤية والصوت. لنعد إلى المصير، أو كيف يمكن أن يكون البحث عن الخلاص عبر المقاومة والاحتجاج، والأهم الإيمان بالقضية بوصفها ما يجمع بين هذين الكاتبين. إذ نقع في رواية لجيمس بالدوين بعنوان لو كان لشارع بيل أن يتكلم، ولا سيما في الصفحة الأخيرة نقع على دلالة حملتها جملة قد تبدو للبعض عابرة، ولكنها تبدو لي على قدر كبير من الأهمية، حيث تمكننا هذه الجملة من استحضار صدى صوت كنفاني، أو ربما أنها قد تنقلنا إلى أجواء غسان كنفاني، ولا سيما أننا نسمع صدى خطابين ينبثقان من العتمة عينها، أو من ذلك الإحساس المأساوي بالاستلاب، فضلا عن نبرات الاحتجاج الصاخب في وجه الجلاد. ففي رواية جيمس بالدوين لا نعدم نبرات الغضب التنظيري اتجاه قضية التمثيلات المسبقة للأمريكيين من أصل إفريقي، ولكنها أيضا تعمد إلى الدمج بين العالم والرؤية العميقة له. ولعل هذا ما يجعل بالدوين أو من بالدوين كاتبا عظيما، لا لكونه قد أدرك معضلته الوجودية والإنسانية فحسب، بل لكونه قد استطاع أن يمارس دوره في المجال الخطابي السردي، وهو يمتلك أدواته ويوظفها في سياق وعي فني ناضج، ولكن ضمن فسحة من الزمن. والأهم أنه قد سعى إلى امتلاك فضائه الخاص حينما قرر الرحيل إلى باريس بحثاً عن مناخات أكثر صحية أو حرية للتعبير عن قضيته، بعد أن عانى من مجتمع بدأ يضيق الخناق عليه. يرغب بالدوين في أن يتمثل المجتمع الأمريكي الإفريقي عبر قيمه القائمة على الحب والتكاتف وتقدير العائلة، وواجب العائلة بالدفاع عن أفرادها حتى لو اضطر أحد أفرادها للسرقة أو ارتكاب مخالفة للقانون. وكأن بالدوين يقيم جسما مضادا للمؤسسة، وهذا ما يجعلنا نؤمن بأن هذا الأديب كان يرى أن خلاص قضيته ينهض على عناصر ذات طابع مجتمعي يتصل بالذوات الإفريقية بوصفها أمة لها قيمها الخاصة والمشتركة، وهكذا فهو ينقل الإشكالية إلى القيمة الموجبة للأجيال القادمة. فإصرار الفتاة، وهي إحدى شخصيات الرواية في رواية لو كان لشارع بيل أن يتكلم واسمه يتش، على إنجاب طفل من فوني يحيل إلى التشبث بالوجود والمقاومة. فلا جرم أن نقرأ في ختام الرواية صرخات الطفل عند الولادة، لعلها صرخات احتجاج في وجه المنظومة العنصرية. وهنا أنا الآن أقتبس من الرواية، وهي الجملة الأخيرة في الرواية، حيث جاء: فوني يعمل بالخشب بالحجر، يصفر مبتسما، ومن البعيد مقتربا شيئا فشيئا كان الطفل يصرخ ويصرخ 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 كأنه يتعمد إيقاظ الميت. لا شك بأن ثمة ملحوظتين شديدتي الأهمية تتصلان بمنظور بالدوين وتعالقها مع غسان كنفاني، وتنهض على إدانة السلبية والدعوة إلى الاحتجاج. فصرخة الطفل لا تختلف كثيرا عن العبارة الختامية التي جاءت في رواية غسان كنفاني رجال في الشمس، ونعني العبارة الشهيرة: لماذا لم يدقوا جدران الخزان؟ والعبارة كما نلاحظ أنها تحمل نفس القدر من الاحتجاج والصراخ. لا يمكن إلا أن نعترف بأن كلا الروايتين أو كلا المنظورين لكلا الكاتبين يحتملان القدر عينه من الرؤية، كما نبرات الغضب والاحتجاج التي تسعى لأن ترفض الاستكانة. وهكذا نتلمس وعيا عميقا بمشكلة الذات، لا من رؤية محدودة تختص بالفرد فحسب، إنما تشمل ذلك الوعي الجمعي الذي يتعلق بمنطوق أمة أو فئة مضطهدة. فهذا ينطلق من وعي إنساني كوني بأهمية مقاومة الظلم وتمكين الصوت في إدانة هذه المتعاليات من الطبقات العميقة لصيغ التمثيلات التي تنال من قدر الإنسان بغض النظر عن تموضعها في المكان أو الزمان. في هذين التوجهين تمكين لوعي ثقافي يرتبط بجذور عميقة، وفي معظمها يتصل بمناهضة التمييز والهيمنة الخطابية، كما الاعتناء بمعاني التحرر التي نرى صيغتها في تحولات بالدوين اتجاه القضية الفلسطينية، حيث أدرك عدالتها عندما قدر له أن يطلع على كافة حيثيات الإشكال العنصري العميق الذي تنطلق منه الرؤية أو الرواية الصهيونية، بل أنه أدرك قيم المكون الكولونيالي لهذا المشروع. لا يمكن أن ننكر بأي حال من الأحوال بأن التكوينات السردية لكلا الكاتبين تحمل قدرا من تشكيل النسق، وربما يكون النسق عينا، ولا سيما في بناء متتالية من المقاومة اتجاه أزمة بدت في كثير من الأحيان تتقاطع في سياقها الزمني، ولا سيما مواجهة ذروة التمييز العنصري في الولايات المتحدة بالتضافر مع بروز حدث النكبة ومن ثم النكسة. يبدو أن النموذج الأول يأتي بوصفه نتاج عنصرية عرقية لونية، في حين أن الآخر أو القضية الفلسطينية تعاني من عنصرية عميقة لا تتصل فقط بالإشكال العرقي، وإنما تنهض على صيغة من الخطابات التوراتية الدينية التي دعمتها نماذج خطابية لمؤرخين حاولوا محو الوجود الفلسطيني ونفيه تاريخيا، ومن ثم محاولة نفي هذا الوجود على المستوى الفيزيائي سياسيا. وهنا تكمن حقيقة بأن كلا الكاتبين قد أدرك مشكلة وجوده بالتوازي مع أزمته الذاتية، لا من منظور فردي فقط، إنما عبر وعي مجتمعي أو جمعي مشترك يشمل الوعي الإنساني برمته. إن صرخة الطفل في رواية بالدوين قد يبدو إحالة للمستقبل، وهذا يتوافق مع رواية أخرى لغسان كنفاني، ونعني رواية عائد إلى حيفا، حيث يبدو لنا تصور غسان كنفاني اتجاه الأفق المستقبلي متصلا بشيء واضح، ألا وهو أن على الفلسطيني أن يقاوم وأن يمارس الاحتجاج، وإذ لا يتحقق إلا عبر فعل الالتزام بالقضية الفلسطينية أو بالقضية. ويتضح هذا طبعا على المستوى السردي عند مواجهة الأب مع ابنه الذي أصبح دوف الجندي في جيش الاحتلال اليهودي، فيدرك الأب بعد حواره مع الابن بأن عليه أن يتخلى عن خوفه وحذره وأن يتقبل أن يلتحق ابنه الثاني بالمقاومة الفلسطينية. وبذلك فإن كنفاني يؤسس وعيا مستقبليا بالمقاومة ينهض على أن الإنسان موقف وقضية. وهذا ما يتوافق تماما مع رواية جيمس بالدوين لو كان لشارع بيل أن يتكلم. إن النقوص نحو الذات الحرة المقاومة كان خلاص شخصيات بالدون بما فيهم شخصية فوني. فالحرية تعني ألا تكون تابعا اتكاء على تنظيرات دراسات التابع. وهنا يلخص بالدوين هذا الإحساس على لسان الراوي في الرواية. وهنا أقتبس حيث جاء: إن الشعور الذي أنقذ فوني كان هو نفسه الذي سبب له المشاكل وأودى به إلى السجن، فقد وجد محور اهتمامه الخاص في داخله وكان ذلك باديا عليه، لم يكن عبدا لأحد، الأمر الذي يعتبر بحد ذاته جريمة في هذا البلد الحر القميء. ربما كان الفعل الضاغط للنظام المؤسسي الأبيض يقود الآخر لمصائر غير سوية، فوالد فوني يموت في سيارته نتيجة عجزه عن مساعدة ابنه، بينما الفتاة ييتش تفكر بالعمل في الدعارة لتوفير بعض المال، في حين أن النظام القضائي يبدو منغمسا في تمكين النهج العنصري حيث يمارس الكذب وتحييد قيمه. ولعل تتبع مواضع الصيغ الخطابية سيكشف لنا أن جيمس بالدوين قد انطلق من فكرة قوامها أن أمريكا متشظية ومفلسة إنسانيا، حيث نقرأ الإشارة إلى المجتمع الأبيض ومؤسسته عبر ضمير الغائب، ولا سيما استخدام الضمير هم، مما يحيل إلى الانقسام. إن هذا النقد عينه الذي يتبناه بالدوين يكاد يتوافق مع منظور غسان كنفاني، حيث نرى شخصية أم سعد في أم سعد قد تبدو شبيهة بشخصية فوني في رواية بالدوين، ولا سيما في البحث عن الإرادة الحرة للمقاومة، بالتضافر مع نبذ كافة النماذج التي تحول دون تخلصها من عار الهزيمة. وهذا ما يمكن أن نجده أيضا في رواية أخرى لغسان كنفاني، ونعني رواية ما تبقى لكم، حيث نقرأ شيئا من التماثل بين شخصيتي هذا العمل مريم وحامد، وبين شخصيتي فوني وييتش الفتاة، حيث أو ثمة قدر لا مفر منه. هذا القدر صاغته قيم العنصرية والاستلاب للوجود تبعا لمقولات توراتية في أعمال غسان كنفاني أو عرقية بائدة. فالفتاة في رواية بالدوين تتعرض للاغتصاب أو تتعرض لمحاولة الاعتداء الجنسي، وهذا ما يكاد يتماثل في رواية ما تبقى لكم حين تتعرض مريم للاغتصاب على يد زكريا الخائن. وهنا تبدو لنا الثيمة الجنسية بوصفها إحالة إلى محاولة امتلاك الجسد وهتك الروح التي تحتويها، وهي متتالية مهيمنة في الخطاب ما بعد الكولونيالي. إن هذا التقدير لوجود الأبيض المغتصب في رواية بالدوين كما شخصية زكريا الخائن في رواية كنفاني يحيل إلى محاولة التملك والاستحواذ، ولكن الأهم إصابة الذات بعطب مستمر ودائم. هذه الأجواء بين الروايتين لا نعني بها فعل تأثر أو تأثير ضمن مقولة التناص، بمقدار ما هي رؤية فكرية عميقة تنتج عن لا وعي إنساني عميق، ونقصد بذلك الوعي المستعمر أو وعي المستعمر أو وعي المقهورين. وهنا نحيل إلى روايات كثيرة نهضت على فعل السلب للذات الأخرى، وهذا ما يمكن أن نلمحه في سردية بالدوين، حيث يصف لنا مشاهد العداء الأبيض للمكون المختلف. وهنا أضطر لتوصيف لقاء الفتاة ييتش بالشرطي الأبيض بيل، حيث تتعالى استهامات الثاني الجنسية إلى درجة أن ييتش تستشعر امتعاضه عند لقائه بها. ثالثا، الوعي بالقضية. لا يمكن أن ننكر بأن وعي بالدوين بالقضية الفلسطينية حاضر على الرغم من إشكاليته، فهو لا يشكل سوى مدخل لذلك الفيض المشترك بين الذوات التي تعرضت للانتهاك من قبل النزعات العنصرية العرقية، وهنا لا يمكن إلا أن نمضي كثيرا في قراءة تحولات بالدوين اتجاه القضية الفلسطينية، على الرغم من أنه قد بدأ مؤيدا لوجود إسرائيل في زيارته الأولى لهذا الكيان، ولكنه سرعان ما أدرك الأدوار السياسية لهذا الكيان بوصفه مدخلا لهيمنة الدول الغربية، وبوصف إسرائيل قاعدة كولونيالية تخضع لمشترك تتقاسمه التطلعات الاستعمارية وأنظمة التمييز العنصري. وبذلك فإن قدرة بالدوين على التخلص من الدعاية الإسرائيلية لم يتحقق إلا لكونه قد استشعر تماثل التجربة الفلسطينية وتجربة الأفارقة أو الأمريكيين الأفارقة عامة، في حين أن غسان كنفاني كان ينطلق من أيديولوجيته أو فكره الثوري اليساري، غير أن قضيته بدت على قدر كبير من التعقيد حينها، كما بدا حينها عالقا في منظوره الأممي اليساري، غير أن نقطة التحول التي تجمع بين الاثنين ذلك الإدراك المبكر لدور الصهيونية، حيث أشار إلى ذلك كنفاني في كتابه النقدي بعنوان في الأدب الصهيوني، حيث في حين يصرح بالدوين في غير موضع من كتاباته بأنه لم يكن معاديا للسامية إنما كان معاديا للصهيونية. وهنا نلتقط ما يماثل هذا الإدراك المبكر للدور الصهيوني كما تمثل في دراسات مبكرة لغسان كنفاني عن الآداب الصهيونية والكتابة والمقاومة، مما يشكل نوعا من المشترك وقيم الموازاة بين الرجلين في نقدهما العميق للذات وإدراكهما للإشكالية التي تتصل بأزمة. وهنا نرى بالدوين وكنفاني قد ظهرا في كثير من الأحيان أقرب إلى من يجلد الذات أو يقسو عليها، بل أنهما في نصوصهما قد اقتربا من مبدأ محاكمة يقيمها كل منهما لذاته أو لذوات شخوصه السردية. لقد بدأ أن غسان كنفاني من أكثر المنتقدين للشخصية الفلسطينية، حيث يطلق عليه حكما إذا ما حادت عن التزامها تجاه قضيتها، فلا جرم إذن أن يجعل من شخصيات رواية رجال في الشمس تنتهي إلى مصير باحث، حيث تلقى جثث 3 رجال على قمة مزبلة تقع على الحدود مع نقد واضح لعجز القيادة. إن هذا القدر من الانبعاث السوداوي لتكوين الذات ومواجهتها بواجباتها نكاد نراه في سياق مختلف في أدب بالدوين على الرغم من اختلاف السياق، ولكنه يحمل الآلية عينها كما في رواية غرفة جيوفاني. فهناك نرى هذا الوعي بالاختلاف والانفتاح على أسئلة عميقة أو جوهرية تتصل بمعاني الوجود ومعنى الاختيار ونقد الذات. وإن بدا بالدوين في هذه الرواية ذاتيا ينطلق من إشكالية جنسية، غير أنه حقيقة ينطلق من الوعي عينه لمواجهة الذات ونقدها في حدود محاكمتها بشكل واضح وجلي. وختاما، لا يمكن أن ننكر بأن كلا الرجلين قد تميزا بكتابة المقال كما الكتابة ضمن سياق تنظيري، فغسان كنفاني اشتهر بمقالاته الساخرة واللاذعة علاوة عن وضعه لكتابين مهمين حول الأدب الفلسطيني والمقاومة في مواجهة الصهيونية، في حين أن بالدوين نشر عددا من الكتب التي جاءت على شكل مقالات أحدثت أثرا كبيرا في تمكين نموذجه الساعي للتخلص من التمييز العنصري والالتزام بمبادئ حركات التحرر في أمريكا في ذلك الوقت. وشكرا لك.
Shukran. Thank you very much for your very insightful analysis of the novels. I mean, putting Baldwin's novels, especially Giovanni's Room and If Beale Street Could Speak, in conversation with Kanafani's novels, particularly Men in the Sun and Return to Haifa, I think are both, I think is a lot of food for thought that I think we'll want to return to.
Thank you very much.
Next, we're going to hear from Robin Kelley. Go ahead.
Unmute. Okay, thank you. Okay, such an honor to be here. That was 2 excellent talks. I learned so much. I was sort of doing some revisions as I listened. I want to thank you for the opportunity. I'm also speaking from the unceded territory of the Tongva peoples in a building named after Ralph Bunche. So just reflect on that for a minute. So today is also the 51st anniversary of the assassination of Fred Hampton and Mark Clark, members of the Black Panther Party in Chicago. And also in 2 weeks, Barbara Harlow, the author, would have turned 72 had she lived. And I dedicate these remarks in their frame in some ways through their memory. But what I want to say really is informed, especially by Harlow's book, Afterlives, Legacies of Revolutionary Writing, which revisits 3 assassinated revolutionaries, the Salvadorian militant Roque Dalton, the South African communist Ruth First, and of course, Ghassan Kanafani. She thinks through the futures of anti-imperialist movements in an era marked by defeat and compromise, and she reads their texts and reads their lives in order to find alternative possibilities for the future. Those are her words. Or to put it another way, she looks back at the ways in which these intellectuals looked ahead. So what I want to do with my time is to look back at Kanafani's returning to Haifa in the context of the emergence of an anti-imperialist Palestinian left and global insurgencies. Now, typically, we read returning to Haifa almost strictly within the bounds of the history of the Nakba, underscoring the irony of replacing one dispossessed people with another. But what I want to propose is a slightly, maybe more expansive reading that reflects on Kanafani's third world Marxism, commitment to internationalism, not to mention the PFLP's solidarity with Black radical insurgencies in the US. And for me, these connections were made even more evident in the stage adaptation of Returning to Haifa by 2 brilliant playwrights, Ismail Khalidi and Naomi Wallace, which I actually saw in 2018. And the play brought out the alternative possibilities for the future in a vision of how Kanafani and perhaps a generation of revolutionary intellectuals looked ahead. And just a side note, just consider at some point Sim Khalidi's plays as one of the subjects for Palestine Writes. I mean, this is one of the great playwrights of our generation for sure, and it would be great to have a panel just on his work. Just hint, hint, hint. Okay, so Returning to Haifa was a product of both the '67 war and the global insurgencies of '68. And as everyone here knows, in the aftermath of the '67 war, the Arab National Movement merged with Youth for Revenge and the Palestine Liberation Front to form the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, or PFLP. And PFLP embraced a Palestinian identity rooted in third world oriented radical nationalism, and officially identified as a Marxist-Leninist organization by 1969, the year that the novel was published. Kanafani became the inaugural editor of the PFLP's weekly journal, Al-Hadaf, and he was arguably the foremost Marxist thinker in the organization. The PFLP envisioned a single, democratic, potentially socialist Palestinian state in which all peoples would enjoy citizenship. Moreover, the movement had come to see itself as part of a global anti-imperialist movement in solidarity with other non-aligned or socialist nations and revolutionary movements like the Black Panther Party. By the spring and summer of 1970, some Panthers actually had begun military training at the PFLP training camps in Jordan and Lebanon. Now, the point I wish to underscore here, because I don't want to tell all this history, is that the radicalization of the Palestinian movement between 1967 and the early 70s coincides with the deepening ideological fissures in the Black liberation movement, especially around criticisms of Israel. And also we see a surge of Black Arab solidarity in the US. But keep in mind, and I really want to emphasize this, that the Black Palestine solidarity was specifically between a Black left, which is a political minority, and a Palestinian left, based on a radical anti-imperialist agenda. They stood in direct opposition to the Black liberal defense of Zionism, a position from which Baldwin ultimately extricated himself, as Bill Mullen will talk about after me. And by the way, I'm not talking about Baldwin for this talk, mostly about Kanafani and other things. Most of us are familiar with the full-page ad that the New York Times put out in 1970, was written by A. Philip Randolph and Byron Rustin, defending Israel and specifically appealing for more funding for Israel's military. But I want to focus on the response by a coalition of Black radicals formed under the name of the Committee of Black Americans for Truth About the Middle East. And they had published a response to the New York Times ad titled "An Appeal by Black Americans Against United States Support of the Zionist Government of Israel." The statement implicates the US in the slaughter of Palestinian refugees in Jordan, which it linked to US proxy wars in Southeast Asia, South Africa, Greece, and Iran. It expressed unrelenting opposition to anti-Semitism and Zionism, which it characterized as, quote, a racist ideology that justifies the expulsion of the Palestinian people from their homes and lands and attempts to enlist the Jewish masses of Israel and elsewhere in the service of imperialism to hold back the Middle East revolution. Now, the statement situated the struggle in Palestine within a broader global anti-colonial revolution and called Israel a white settler state comparable to South Africa and what was then called Rhodesia. What was most striking about the statement was its conception of solidarity and the indivisibility of justice that extended to, Sephardic Jews, to Native Americans, to Puerto Ricans, to Chicanos, and the Israeli left. And it even quoted a document drafted by members of the Israeli Socialist Organization in 1966, committed to what they called a de-Zionized Israel, the abolition of Jewish supremacy, and an anti-imperialist foreign policy actively supporting the forces struggling for socialism and unification in the Arab world. Now, Palestinian militants, especially the PFLP, had also begun to reach out directly to African Americans. About a week before the New York Times ran the Randolph-Rustin pro-Israel ad, which was signed by a bunch of people, we go into that. The Baltimore Afro-American, which is a Black newspaper, published a profile on PFLP militant Rod Abdul Wahad, who's a Palestinian of African descent in Haifa, born in Haifa rather, but displaced by the Nakba and forced into a West Bank refugee camp. And he emphasized that resistance to the occupation was both a struggle against colonialism and racism. He explained that Black Palestinians were on the forefront of fighting Israeli forces in Jericho, in Haifa, Jerusalem, and Gaza. And he talked about the racism they experienced in Israel. Wahad also acknowledged that he and his brothers, also PFLP members, follow the Black freedom movement in the US closely. And he said, quote, "Our struggle is the same. We in the PFLP are fighting racism and religious chauvinism. Our aim is to create a free Palestine in which Arabs and Jews can live as equal citizens with regard to rights and duties, form in an integral part of a national democratic state." Now, Kanafani published Returning to Haifa in 1969, and the story deals forthrightly with the question of dispossession and colonial violence that, to paraphrase Amilcar Cabral, the great Guinean revolutionary, interrupted Palestinian history. Now, Kanafani succeeds in conveying the consequences of settler colonialism, not so much in his description of the violence, but in thinking about the afterlives of these crimes, the ongoing and ever-present condition of colonialism. And forgive me for giving a little synopsis. I know that some people on this list of 200 plus people actually are not familiar with the play, because I know them. 99% maybe. So let me just give you just a quick overview so you could see where it's going. So the play is set in 1967, during the beginnings of the occupation, when the Israeli state allowed Palestinians who had been dispossessed in 48 to visit their former homes. And to be clear, they were not granted the right to return or to repossess their belongings, just the right to visit temporarily to see what they left behind. And the main protagonist the middle-aged couple, Safiya and Saeed, make the painful decision to return to Haifa, the city where they not only lost their possessions and home, but their infant son, who was home with a babysitter at the time of the Nakba. They return and confront the current owner of their house, a Polish Jew named Miriam, who herself experienced dispossession under German colonization and the Holocaust. And in 1948, she and her husband take possession of their home, belongings, and their child, who the state allows them to adopt, or insists that they adopt. The infant, once called Khaldun, is now a grown man named Dov, an Israeli soldier mobilized in the aftermath of the war. And he does not recognize his parents except as Arabs, as existential threats to the Israeli state. Saeed and Safiya's other son is preparing to join Fatah and take to the hills. Now, Khaledi and Wallace's adaptation of the novel was commissioned by the Public Theater in New York, but as some of you know, Zionist pressure on the board led to its cancellation. So it was eventually produced in London at the tiny Finborough Theater in 2018, directed by Caitlin MacLeod. And seeing it, for me, for the first time in such an intimate setting, in a sparse set, in a circle, somehow brought out its global world-making implications and connected to the Black freedom struggle. So Khaledi and Wallace insert a scene about how Israeli security forces left everything in the house except for Saeed's books. And you know, when asked about the books, Miriam replies, "Men came, took them away. You know, they said it was state business." And it's a very poignant moment that reminded me of two things. One, the poet and activist Sabawi, forgive me, Sabawi, pointed out how Israel systematically dismantled Palestinians' commercial, cultural, and artistic infrastructure, which included seizing a massive body of literature in Arabic held in private hands and libraries that was largely destroyed or ended up in the collections of Israel's National Library. Palestinians are still barred from reclaiming these rare texts on the basis of absentee property laws that render all of this stolen property as abandoned. The second thing was, and some of you may know this, after the assassination of George Jackson in San Quentin prison by prison guards, the state literally seized all of his books and writings and initially would not relinquish them to his family. And among the few things they were willing to release to his mother were two poems written in Jackson's hand, one entitled Enemy of the Sun, which the Black Panther newspaper published under Jackson's name, but as it turned out, as we know, was written by the Palestinian poet Sami Al-Qasim. Enemy of the Sun first appeared in Al-Qasim's debut collection of poetry in 1958, titled Procession of the Sun, but then was reprinted in 1970 in a collection titled Enemy of the Sun, Poetry of Palestinian Resistance, which was put out by a radical Black-run publishing house based in Washington, D.C. called Drum and Spear Press. So Jackson had the book and copied the poem by hand to share with others. And as many of you know, this kind of poetic mistake became the basis for this beautiful exhibition curated by Greg Thomas and Mohammed Jamous at the Abushehab Museum for the Prisoners Movement in Nablus, called George Jackson in the Son of Palestine. And it really underscored the critical moment in that early period of the late 60s, early 70s, when Black Palestinian solidarity was an expression of global revolutionary insurgency. So Saeed asked his wife, as we heard already more than once, what is a homeland? What is a home? And the answer, of course, we've heard various translations, is where something like this cannot take place. And this, of course, is the perennial question that Black nationalists were posing, and that is, why they would actually embrace the language of occupation, which is also used by indigenous peoples in the US, why Baldwin, for example, used it in his 1966 essay when he talks about writing from occupied territory. Keep in mind that just a few weeks separated Israel's 1967 occupation and invasion of Jordan, and also the war, and the military occupation of Detroit and Newark, right? And between May 1968 and December 1972, 960 separate Black rebellions in the US took place, mostly provoking military intervention and occupation. Now, Khaldun sometimes serves as a metaphor for the land itself, and failure to save him is perceived, at least by Dove, as failure to stay and fight for the land. But it's much more than that. At one point, Khaldun/Dove says to Said, "Man is the cause." But neither Dove nor Said can place the quote. So Said seizes this phrase and puts a kind of revolutionary internationalist spin on it when he asks, "But what cause?" That's the question. When we take a stand as a human being, it has nothing to do with flesh and blood and identity cards and passports. Can you understand that? So I came away, listening to this again from the play, as well as from the text, thinking of, how even the concept of a single democratic state falls short of capturing the radical imagination, the world making of the Black and Palestinian left in that moment, elements which oppose both nationalist and statist solutions for a free Palestine. So let me just end with, since it is December 4th, Black Panther Party leader Huey P. Newton's assertion in 1970 that national self-determination is impossible under US empire. National sovereignty, he argued, in real democracy is a chimera in a world where the United States can overthrow regimes it doesn't like and prop up those it does. And our very survival, Newton insisted, depended not on creating new states, but on completely transforming society. And just to quote him to close, "After transformation into a socialist society, there may be no need for national separation. This transformation can only take place by wiping out United States imperialism and establishing a new earth, a new society, a new world. So politically and strategically, the correct action to take is not separation, but world revolution in order to wipe out imperialism, and then people will be free to decide their destiny." So thank you. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much. And thank you for really highlighting another really important historical moment, this moment of 67, 68, both for Palestinians and for Black Americans, and particularly in terms of the turning point in the leftist movements in both. So a lot to also talk about there. But without further ado, I want to turn to our last speaker, Bill Mullen, before we open it up to a larger discussion. Bill, take it away.
Thank you so much. Thank you all speakers. Brilliant papers. I'm honored to be here. I want to begin by saying I'm speaking from Shawnee land in the Midwest of the United States. Thank you, Robin, for the shout out to Fred Hampton and Mark Clark on December 4th. I have a very simple argument to make today, which is that James Baldwin was a revolutionary, and that his understanding of Palestinian liberation struggle was fundamental to his becoming a revolutionary, as was his understanding of the full abomination of Zionism and the Zionist project that was Israel. And I'm very touched by what Huzama has said about drawing this connection between 1948 in the years of Kanafani and Baldwin, the years of their exile. And it's a wonderful starting point to think about both of them as products of a post-1948 apartheid world, a world of partition, a world of exile, a world of displacement. And much of Baldwin's writings is about that theme. And I want to get at that theme partly by, while Baldwin never met Kanafani, I would argue that it was his encounter with the Arab world and the Arab liberation struggles of the 1950s and 1960s that brought him in parallel as a revolutionary thinker with Ghassan Kanafani. And in my comments today, I want to focus on kind of 5 moments in Baldwin's development where we can see this coming together, this convergence of Baldwin and notions of both Arab and Palestinian liberation struggle in the post-1948 world. I just say one thing about Baldwin's decision to leave to the US in 1948. He did go to Paris, but he thought temporarily about going to Israel. And he wrote later on in 1972, he said, if I had fled to Israel, a state created for the purpose of protecting Western interests, I would have been yet in a tighter bind. On which side of Jerusalem would I have decided to live? Well, Baldwin understood from the beginning that Israel was a Western imperial project, that it was a settler colonial project, that it was a project of what he would have understood as a kind of Jim Crow, right? He left the United States saying, racism was going to either make me kill someone or someone was going to kill me. It was literally a live or die decision he made to leave the US to go to Paris. And once he's there, one of the first things he encounters, in addition to his sort of quest for an identity for himself outside of the US, an identity in exile, is the Algerian liberation struggle. It's important to remember that 6 years after his arrival, the National Liberation Front begins its war against the French occupation. Baldwin is in Paris at the time. He's seen gendarmes beat Arab peanut vendors on the streets of Paris. He writes about this very movingly in his published and unpublished work about time in Paris. He remembers that in 1945, the Sétif massacre had occurred, in which French police had killed 103 Algerian demonstrators. In 1955, 1 year into the Algerian liberation struggle, he's arrested. He's charged with stealing a bedsheet in a hotel, and he's put into a French jail. And in jail, he writes this brilliant essay in which he says, everyone looked like me. But what he means is they're dark-skinned North Africans. It's the Algerian and the Moroccan poor who are shackled in these Parisian jails. And he writes something very profound about this moment. He said, the Arabs were together in Paris, but the American blacks were alone. As I began to discern what their history have made of them, meaning the Arabs, I began to suspect somewhat painfully what my history had made of me. Well, this is a pretty extraordinary moment of transnational solidarity, where Baldwin is seeing himself as a displaced African-American in a French prison as a kind of colonial subject suddenly. And in fact, he begins to pay very close attention to the Algerian war for independence. He writes, the Arabs were not a part of Indochina, but they were part of an empire visibly and swiftly crumbling, and part of a history which was achieving, in the most literal and frightening sense, its denouement. He sees the Algerian struggle against the French occupation of Algeria in tandem with the war in Vietnam, which his own country has inherited. Baldwin is going to become a fierce critic of the US war in Vietnam, but it begins in the 1950s with his understanding of the colonial conflict, the French colonial conflict, and the repression of the Algerian liberation struggle while he's there. The second moment I want to talk about in Baldwin's kind of evolution of consciousness is his actual visit to Israel in 1961. He goes there as a guest of the state. It's a complicated moment for him. He's not even sure he wants to be there. And he writes, you can't walk 5 minutes without finding yourself at a border. And of course, the entire Arab situation outside the country and above all within, the fact that Israel is a homeland for so many Jews causes me to feel my own homelessness more keenly than ever. Well, again, a very profound moment of displacement where he recognizes the state of Israel actually as a reminder of his own dispossession. And he reads it through what he's really talking about here are Palestinians, the Arab situation that he is understanding as the dispossessed of the new, but is still a relatively new Israeli project. And in fact, it's when he was traveling in Israel in '61, he was writing his great book, The Fire Next Time. He was actually carrying the manuscript in his briefcase. And I want to say just 2 things about that. One of the things that The Fire Next Time is about is Baldwin coming to terms with Islam, coming to terms with Malcolm X. It actually begins as a sit down with Elijah Muhammad as he's trying to understand what is the magical appeal of Malcolm X to the Black working class of the United States, right? So in this very moment in which he's grappling with questions of race and religion at home, he's trying to comprehend now what I would call the impact of Israeli settler colonialism on the Arab. And he writes, when I was in Israel, so it was as though I was in the middle of the fire next time. Drawing analogy here, right, between displacement, dispossession, and racial regimes, okay? I think it's a powerful subtext and a way of rereading that book in the context of Baldwin's emerging internationalist empathy and sympathy with Arab liberation struggle. In fact, that trip to Israel is what, in my mind, motivated Baldwin to say to Margaret Mead later on in a conversation in the early 70s, you've got to remember that I have been in America, the Arab at the hands of the Jews, okay? It's a profound comment we might come back and reflect on a bit more. It enraged Zionists, but it was part of Baldwin's dispossession of Zionism itself, part of his trying to analogize, find parallels between the struggles in the Arab liberation movement and his own struggles for Black liberation at home. The third moment I want to talk about is actually very relevant to Robin's remarks about the Black Panther Party and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Baldwin was close friends with Huey Newton, close friends with Bobby Seale, attended Panther fundraisers. And it's very clear if you read the records from 67 to 72, Baldwin himself moves far to the left on the question of Zionism. He's very influenced by SNCC's. In 1967, SNCC publishes a manifesto basically declaring Zionism a settler colonial project. Baldwin's paying very close attention. And in 1972, and I want to talk about this for a moment. 1972, in May of 1972, Baldwin publishes a book called No Name in the Street. It's one of his most comprehensive analysis of the role of imperialism and settler colonialism in the Western world. It's published 6 months before Kanafani is murdered by Mossad. I make that point to kind of draw convergences here between where Baldwin is moving and where Kanafani's life ends out. And I'll come back to Kanafani and the PFLP to a moment. The closest they came in my reading of Baldwin's life is in a work I'll cite momentarily. But in No Name in the Street, this is Baldwin thinking as an internationalist now, linking his experiential understanding of the Algerian liberation struggle, anti-colonial movements in Africa and South America to Black freedom struggle at home. And he writes, any real commitment to Black freedom in this country would have the effect of reordering all of our priorities and altering all our commitments so that, for horrendous example, we would be supporting Black freedom fighters in South Africa and Angola and would not be allied with Portugal, would be closer to Cuba than we are to Spain, would be supporting the Arab nations instead of Israel, and would never have felt compelled to follow the French into Southeast Asia. This passage reminds me of Kanafani on imperialism. Imperialism has laid its body over the world, the head in Eastern Asia, the heart in the Middle East, its arteries reaching Africa and Latin America. Wherever you strike it, you damage it, and you serve the world revolution. My fourth passage, I'm giving this paper in Baldwin's words because they're much better than anybody else's, is from a work of his fiction. Baldwin and Kanafani both identified the role of the novelist as a revolutionary. It's very explicit in Baldwin. He says the artist is a revolutionary. Kanafani said, my politics and my novels co-constitute each other. In 1979, in a late novel that not a lot of people read, but people should read, it's called Just Above My Head. Baldwin's protagonist, Hall Montana, is taking a flight across the United States. We're several years into U.S. anti-terrorist hysteria, prompted mainly by the PFLP hijackings. And Baldwin's protagonist sits down for his flight, and he thinks this to himself: the people in the seats of power have only themselves to blame for these hijackings. Who indeed hijacked more than England has for example? Or who is more skilled in the uses of terror than my own unhappy country? Yes, I know. Nevertheless, children, what goes round comes around. What you sent out comes back to you. A terrorist is called that only because he does not have the power of the state behind him. Indeed, he has no state, which is why he is a terrorist. Well, one thing you might hear here is an echo of Malcolm X, chickens coming home to roost. This is a meditation on imperialism, empire, and state-sanctioned violence against oppressed peoples. This notion of this Baldwin identifying here with the stateless subject in 1979 shows us by the late 70s how he was beginning to internalize the Palestinian struggle. He was thinking about statelessness because it was endemic to his own struggle. When he left in 48, he became stateless himself. He said about that, he said, no one chooses to leave their homeland. People romanticize his travel to Paris. He said, no one chooses to leave their homeland, okay? So I think this 48 to 70, 72 to 79 trajectory of thinking about himself as a displaced exilic figure is quite profoundly rendered here in a sympathetic way, thinking about Palestinian statelessness and state violence, okay? The last moment, I think it might be okay for time. The last moment I want to talk about is in the same year, 1979. Baldwin has always been a profound critic of US imperialism. In 1979, Andrew Young, the African-American US ambassador to the United Nations, was fired by Jimmy Carter for having a secret meeting with Zedi Terzi, who was the PLO observer to the United Nations, which was officially in violation of US policy. Baldwin was beside himself. He was angry. Young had been an advisor to Martin Luther King. And he wrote this about Andrew Young's firing. He says, the Zionists, as distinguished from the people known as Jews, using, as someone put it, the available political machinery, i.e. colonialism, e.g. the British Empire, promised the British that if the territory were given to them, the British Empire would be safe forever. The Palestinians have been paying for the British colonial policy of divide and rule and for Europe's guilty Christian conscience for more than 30 years. There is no hope of peace in the Middle East without dealing with the Palestinians. And he adds as a footnote here to his essay, the fact that Israel has been supplying arms to South Africa and oil from South Africa to Israel. And I find this conjuncture in 1979 kind of profound too, because 1948 is also the year of South African apartheid, right? It's the year when that regime comes into power. So I'm thinking now a little bit about Baldwin and Kanafani in a post-1948 world. And for me, this piece is a powerful culmination of some of his own thinking about that. Just a last thought, two more passages if I can. There's been so much beautiful imaginative thinking about Palestinian futures at this conference, both at the science fiction panel yesterday, the poetry readings. And I wanted to end with two to my beautiful forward-thinking quotations from Kanafani and Baldwin. Kanafani wrote, everything in this world can be robbed and stolen except one thing. This one thing is the love that emanates from a human being towards a solid commitment to a fiction or cause. And we use that passage in the program for Palestine Writes because I think it moved many of us. And James Baldwin wrote this, I'm optimistic about the future, but not about the future of this civilization. I'm optimistic about the civilization which will replace this one. Thank you.
Wow, thank you. What a way to end these 4 brilliant talks. I'm gonna let everyone sit for a moment with that as we get virtual claps coming into the chat. And I would also encourage those of you who are listening and attending, if you have questions, I saw a few questions in the chat, but they're obscured now. So if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A, and we will try to get to as many of them as we can in the remaining 16 minutes that we have. So The first question is for you, Bill. Can you talk about how you came to know about the work of Kanafani and what effect it's had on your political and academic life? Why is he still not read in literature departments in the US?
For me?
For you.
Rana Barakat, I don't know if she's on this, if she's out in the internet land today, introduced me to Kanafani in 2012 when I was on my first trip to Palestine. I'm a latecomer to Kanafani, sadly to say. Robin was on that trip as well. It was really life-changing, both the trip and reading Kanafani for the first time. I ran home and I started teaching Men in the Sun and Other Stories. And I mean life-changing. I'm a literature person by training, and you know, I taught a class called Literature and Imperialism, and I couldn't believe how magnificently Kanafani's book opened up Palestinian history for young white kids in Indiana who knew nothing, and actually worked magically to make them understand sympathetically the Nakba and displacement. And so I'm eternally grateful to Rana for that introduction. That would be my response to that question.
Thank you. Robin, a question for you. Your tracing of connections between the Black left and Palestinian left was really good. I'm not sure though how we are to read Return to Haifa, the story, meaning referring to the story, not the play, as an expression of internationalism. Might we see his statement, man as a cause, as his commitment to Palestinian liberation? Is there not a difference between nationalism as limited and regressive and a revolutionary nationalism for the colonized?
That's a really good question. And in fact, I'm not suggesting that this was even Kanafani's intention. I guess what I'm saying is that in terms of reading and seeing the play and just the way the play was structured, what it did for me as a reader, but also knowing his politics and the relationship between what the PFLP was trying to do, that, you know, was definitely embedded in a nationalist discourse, no question about it, but it was also an internationalist discourse. So I kind of connected, I made a great leap of connecting the politics of the moment that linked Black and Palestinian solidarity to not a politics of analogy, sort of rejecting the notion that somehow because they're oppressed in similar ways that connects them, rather than a larger vision of how to transform the world. And I have come to believe that if we look at Kanafani's entire oeuvre, like Baldwin, like what's been said on this panel, that you can see that internationalism embedded there. But yes, it's true that man as a cause definitely refers to the specificity of the Palestinian nation. Man as a cause also is a line that comes from Ralph Waldo Emerson's Self-Reliance, when he says every true man is a cause, a country, and an age. And I don't know if anyone links that quote or not, but I do think that it's in the play and in the text where he has that text where he talks about you know, moving beyond the accoutrements of national identification, identity cards, passports, blood, that poses a question for all of us about what does a liberated Palestine actually look like within a liberated world.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions asking for references and bibliographies. I think we're going to maybe work on that with the organizers and try to provide that for folks so that we have it in writing. So I won't deal with those specifically. Does anyone know if Frantz Fanon ever met Baldwin?
Oh, Bill would know that, but my guess is, wasn't Baldwin at the 1958 conference in Paris?
Yeah.
So they probably had to have met.
He saw Fanon speak at a African Writers Conference that Robin was referring to in 56 maybe, and
56.
wrote a report on it. It was interesting. He wasn't really down with Pan-Africanism yet, Baldwin,
Right.
but that was the closest encounter that I could find between them as people.
So another question, this is to all of the panelists. How can we think of these writers as non-individuated figures? In other words, how can we see them vis-a-vis other rightists and artists who are not so canonized? And this might actually be a question for Huzama and Rami to think about them, particularly Kanafani, but Baldwin as well, but maybe specifically Kanafani, thinking of him not just as an individual, because we often talk about him as an individual, but he was very much embedded within a larger movement. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
Regarding Kanafani, it's very tricky sometimes that a lot of people, when they first hear about Kanafani or read his works, they just tend to confine him with the Palestinian cause, which is fine and great. But it's interestingly enough that some of his works is being revisited recently, and I'm talking maybe specifically about Men in the Sun, you know, Rijal fi Shams, this famous novel. Now, and we all know that the story is about 3 Palestinian refugees who are trying to cross the borders from Iraq to Kuwait illegally by the help of a corrupt smuggler. And they end up, unfortunately, dead inside the lorry, inside the water tank of the lorry. And Kanafani, in a way, implies that they are to be blamed for their death because they chose a path which does not lead to their homeland, and that the issue is that they were silent, and there's some sort of a spirit of defeatism and corruption in ways. But this novel, unfortunately, is revisited again these years when you look at these hundreds of thousands of immigrants all over the world crossing the seas or unfriendly borders. And if you can remember, I'm pretty sure all of us, maybe I think 3 years ago in 2015, there was this huge incident at an Austrian border city when a truck was left there deserted, and they found more than 70 bodies suffocated till death. At least maybe 10 or 8 were children. And there was some sort of a literary buzz because people actually talked about men in the sun. So it can be men in the sea, men across barbed wires or across unfriendly borders. So it, as much as the writings of Kanafani was individualistic in itself about his own persona, about his own personal trauma, but still, as I said, and I keep saying that there is some sort of Palestinianism in his work in the case or in the form of trying to project his own feelings and his own personal trauma and his loss onto others. And now even the others' trauma and losses actually can be projected on the Palestinian narrative itself in a way. So I keep telling that what makes true writing immortal and revisited and identifiable and relatable, the fact that it survives the test of time, and it is cross-cultural and is not confined to historical context or even geographical zone. And it proves that the Palestinian cause or question is not only international, but even it has this human element that every single person can truly identify with.
Thank you, Huzama. I think you may have also answered one of our other questions, which is about the fact that events and scholarships commemorating Ghassan Kanafani are repeatedly targeted for harassment and shutting down by Zionists. And so the question is if you can all say a little bit about what you think still makes commemorations of Kanafani and literary resistance generate such vitriol today, and how that might have connected to the words and career of Baldwin. So some of what you're saying, Huzama, I think about Kanafani's writings being not just about Palestinians, but really having resonance with people all over the world. I think that's a part of it. Do others of you want to talk a little bit about why Kanafani engenders so much hostility still today?
Actually, I'll say a couple words about it. Only because, one of the things I mentioned was the public theater's, vicious decision to pull the production. And that's not the first time. I mean, the public theater has a history. But I think what they always invoke, and again, this is not the explanation, but they always invoke is his participation as a member of PFLP, which is deemed a terrorist organization, and whether or not, you know, the relationship between PFLP and the what happened at Lod, that all these things are always invoked. So they don't actually have to deal with the text, you see? And yet that tells us something too, because there's a long history of engaged intellectuals. You know, they kill playwrights young who actually do political work. They kill poets young who do political work, who can commit themselves. And in some ways, there's a kind of death that that James Baldwin experienced, that, you know, Bill sort of suggested here in terms of his decision to be a revolutionary and what that meant in terms of him no longer being the darling of the sort of mainstream literary establishment. You know, so some of that I think is about political choices, but I think there are other reasons too, but that's just my little 2 cents.
I do agree, Robin, with what you're saying, but let me add, as a Palestinian writer, you know, we always feel that it's not only your existence is threatened, it's more beyond than your life. Actually, writing is sort of immortalizing ourselves and our heritage, our culture, and it's a common belief that everywhere it is through it's through your own writing, your own culture, that you preserve your memory and your legacy. Part of our conflict now, and it is gaining even much more importance these days, is that to protect and safeguard your memory and the narrative. It's very important. You have now here a war of narratives now, and it's very easy, because if you have an access to this narrative, if you have tools, if you have people to tell stories, if you have people to write articles, to make studies, to delve deep into history and into culture, you protect yourself through songs, through stories, through even your cooking, through every single thing. All these writings and all these cultural tools and gadgets, in a way, they prove that we are here and we do have a life, because all this is reflected in the culture. And Kanafani was assassinated at the peak of his activity, not only because he was a political activist, he never denied it, but actually it was a means of silencing him. Do you know that this is the first time in Arabic literature that a writer was assassinated? So imagine, at 36 years old, he almost produced around 20 books. So let's imagine if he just, you know, aged well and proper and wrote even well. So the idea here is that you have to preserve your own narrative, and you have to fight for your own narrative. And I just would like to share with you and with all others, you know, when I read this, it's the kind of identity Kanafani was an access for me to my own Palestinian identity as a writer. Before that, at school, I was bullied as a refugee. I was nicknamed so many things. You know, I'm the second generation of Palestinian refugee. My father was working and living in Kuwait. I was born in Kuwait. I never felt that. Of course, I'm Palestinian, and I'm always reminded, sometimes unneededly, that I am Palestinian. And when I read Kanafani, I was in the second year at college, and I read Men in the Sun, and I cried at the very end, because at that moment, I knew what does Palestinian mean, and what kind of life is waiting for me. Strangely or bizarrely or tragically enough, in 1990, when the first Gulf War erupted, I took the other way around from Kuwait to Jordan, across Iraq, and in a sort of illegal way. I was running through the desert, and I slept in the desert because there was no place for me anywhere in that area, and I needed to protect myself. And at that time, I remembered exactly this trip where the 3 refugees in the 60s or in the 50s, in the late 50s, had to take from Jordan to Kuwait, across Iraq, looking for a job. For me, I was leaving everything, and I had to make an arrangement with some people just to pick me from Kuwait to Al-Basra, to Baghdad, to Jordan, and trying as much as possible to hide my credentials and my papers just because I was Palestinian. So it's some sort of vicious circle. And you know that you have to survive. And through this survival process, one thing you need to keep your narrative and to make your voice heard properly. So it's a must. It's some sort of a legacy, a very rich legacy, and we paid a lot to protect this legacy. And I should think that what matters now is the Palestinian narrative. We should all be held responsible to reproduce this narrative and to safeguard our memory, the collective memory. This is all what remains right now. Thank you.
For that, Huzama. And we are at time for our panel. We unfortunately were not able to get to all of the wonderful questions in the Q&A. I would encourage all of you who have attended to feel free to follow up by visiting the bookstore in the Akka showroom of the Palestine Writes Virtual Festival. You can check out a lot of the, you can buy a lot of the books that are written by our esteemed panelists. And many of us have also written articles and other things. You can find some references in the program, in the bios, and through web searches. So we captured, I think, a brilliant microcosm of some of the issues that have come up in terms of the parallel lives of Ghassan Kanafani and James Baldwin. But there's so much more to discuss, and I hope we'll continue to carry these conversations forward in other venues, and hopefully next year at the next Palestine Writes Festival. So thank you to the organizers, thank you to Suzanne and to Bill and to the folks behind the scenes, especially Rawan and Lema. Thank you to the panelists, and thanks to all of you for coming out today.
And thank you, Maha, for your great leadership.
Maha.
Thank you, you're welcome. All right, everyone, take care.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Zama. Thank you, Rami.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Robert, everyone.